Black waitress stops billionaire CEO's wedding after overhearing the bride's shocking betrayal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a moment that no one in the room would ever forget. The lights were dim, the music soft, and the air thick with anticipation. The luxury wedding venue was nothing short of spectacular. Guests dressed in the finest suits and gowns filled the grand hall of the Waitress Lounge, a five-star restaurant perched high above the city. It was a celebration of wealth, beauty, and status, the kind of event that most people only dreamed of attending. At the center of it all stood Richard Kesler, the billionaire CEO, his sharp jawline and tailored suit cutting through the opulence of the room like a blade. He was the embodiment of success, his name synonymous with power and influence. His bride, Nicole, was equally stunning. Her gown shimmered under the chandeliers, and her smile sparkled with the kind of happiness that only the rich and famous could understand. The ceremony had begun, and everything seemed perfect, until, suddenly, the room fell silent. Amara, a young black waitress working the event, had heard something that stopped her in her tracks. She had been moving through the crowd, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, and doing her job as seamlessly as she always did. But the words she overheard from the bride and her maid of honor in a quiet corner changed everything. "I can't believe I'm about to marry him," Nicole whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft music. "I'm only doing this for the money. I've been seeing someone else, someone who can actually give me what I want. This marriage is just a stepping stone." Amara's heart dropped. The betrayal was unmistakable, and it wasn't just any betrayal. It was happening right under the nose of the man who thought he was the one in control. As the guests around her continued to enjoy their drinks, oblivious to the conversation, Amara felt an overwhelming surge of anger and disbelief. She had seen a lot in her life, but nothing like this. Nicole's words rang in her ears, and a part of her felt like she had to do something. But what? She was just a waitress. Just another invisible face in the crowd, doing her job, making sure the guests had what they needed. Yet, in this moment, she realized something. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a bystander. This was a moment that could define everything. She looked at Richard, standing there with his back to her, smiling as if he had no idea what was unfolding behind his back. Amara took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and walked over to him. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as she approached the billionaire. The soft clinking of glasses and murmured conversations faded into the background. Richard's attention shifted to her as she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me, sir," Amara said, her voice calm but firm. "I think you should know something." Richard's face twisted in confusion, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" he asked, clearly irritated that his celebration was being interrupted. "There's something you need to hear about your bride," Amara continued, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. The room went completely still. The guests, sensing something was off, watched in silent anticipation. Richard's gaze hardened, but before he could respond, Amara stepped forward and told him what she had overheard. The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of her words hung in the air. Richard's face went pale as the truth settled in. The shock on his face was undeniable. The woman he loved, the woman he was about to marry, had been lying to him. The silence in the room was deafening. No one knew what to say or do next. The luxury of the wedding, the sparkling chandeliers, the smiles, and the laughter, all of it seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the raw reality of betrayal in the spotlight. And just like that, Amara had turned the tables. She hadn't planned on being the one to reveal the truth. She hadn't expected her words to carry the weight they did. But there she stood, a black waitress, holding the key to the most shocking moment of the night. In the face of a billionaire's wedding, it was she who had the power to expose the lies, the power to change everything. I apologize for the interruption, but Amara could feel the weight of the room's silence pressing down on her. Richard Kesler's face had drained of color as the shocking revelation about his bride continued to echo in the now still room. The guests' glances flicked between Amara and Richard, unsure of what to do next, but the tension was palpable. Amara could feel the judgment of the wealthy elites bearing down on her, but she stood firm, keeping her gaze locked on Richard. He was stunned, his jaw working as if trying to form words, but failing to find them. "You need to leave," Richard finally managed to whisper, the command in his voice more out of shock than authority. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, a signal to those around him that he was trying to regain control of the situation. But no one moved. Amara did not step back. She didn't flinch. She had done what she knew was right, and now, for once, she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about exposing betrayal. This was about justice, about the truth being heard, no matter how uncomfortable it made the powerful feel. "I'm not leaving," Amara said calmly, her voice steady, though the intensity of the moment pulsed through her. "You need to hear this, Richard. Your bride is not who you think she is, and you deserve to know the truth." The room stayed frozen, with every eye on them. Richard stood motionless, unsure of whether to command Amara to leave or demand Nicole explain herself. But Nicole wasn't speaking. In fact, she hadn't moved since Amara had revealed her secret. Her face was pale, her hand tightly gripping the back of her chair as she stared at the floor. It was clear that Nicole wasn't ready to face Richard's wrath. The silence stretched, and the weight of the moment began to sink into Richard. He looked at Nicole, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of pain in his eyes before it was quickly masked by his anger. He had been betrayed by the person he trusted most. He had spent years building his empire, creating wealth and power, and yet none of it could protect him from the pain of being lied to, from the betrayal that was now so clearly laid out in front of him. "Is this true?" Richard's voice was a mixture of disbelief and rage as he turned to Nicole. She didn't answer, her gaze still lowered, her face flushed with shame. The guests waited, all eyes on her now, as if they were waiting for her to either confirm or deny Amara's words. Richard's grip on the back of his chair tightened, and Amara could see the veins in his neck pulse with the force of his anger. But instead of confronting Nicole directly, Richard turned back to Amara. "Why do you care?" he demanded, his voice bitter. "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" The question hung in the air, challenging Amara's motivations, but she didn't hesitate in her response. "What's in it for me?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What's in it for you, Richard? Is money all that matters to you? Do you even know who you're marrying? Do you think she loves you? Or do you just think you own her?" The words hit Richard like a slap to the face. He took a step back, stunned by the sharpness of Amara's words, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, believing that wealth and status would bring him everything, including love. But now, as he looked at the woman he thought he loved, the truth was undeniable. Amara turned her gaze from Richard to Nicole. "You're just using him," Amara said softly. "You don't care about him. You care about what he can give you, and you're willing to destroy him for it." The room was silent once again, but this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer filled with anticipation or discomfort. It was filled with the weight of truth. The guests looked at each other, and some even began to nod, realizing that Amara had just exposed a layer of greed and deception that no one had been willing to confront. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a fool. I've spent so much time chasing after money and power that I never stopped to look at who I was trusting. I didn't see the truth until now." The realization hit him like a flood. For the first time, Richard felt vulnerable. He had always been in control, always the one calling the shots. But here, in this moment, he was exposed. And it was a feeling he had never experienced before. As the truth hung in the air, it became clear that this wasn't just about a wedding. It wasn't about a betrayal between a man and a woman. It was about the power of honesty, of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Amara had shown Richard something he would never forget. She had shown him that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it hurts. The crowd remained still, and for a long while, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with understanding, with the acceptance of the truth. Finally, Richard broke the silence again, but this time his voice was steady, and there was a hint of regret in it. "You saved me tonight," he said, his eyes meeting Amara's. "You showed me what really matters." and I'll never forget it. The guests were left to ponder the gravity of the moment. For some, it was just another dramatic scene in a wealthy billionaire's life, but for others, it was a reminder that money, power, and status could never replace the truth. I apologize for the tension that had taken over the room, but Amara knew there was still more to be said. Richard's voice, though steady, still held a hint of disbelief. He had never been in a position where someone had exposed him in front of so many people, especially not like this. But the words had already been said, and there was no going back. As Amara stood there, she realized that her decision to speak had not just changed the course of the wedding, but possibly the course of Richard's life. The guests around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something more to happen, but no one dared speak up. Richard, still reeling from the shock, turned back to Nicole, his gaze icy. "Is this true?" he asked again, his voice colder this time. Nicole looked up, her face flushed with guilt and fear. She could no longer deny the truth that was now out in the open. But even as she tried to gather the words to explain herself, it was clear to everyone that she had no excuse. Richard's eyes narrowed as he processed the situation. Amara, feeling the weight of the moment, finally broke the silence. "You deserve the truth, Richard," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's not about me or about her. It's about you. You've been living in a world where money and power have made you blind to everything else. This is the wake-up call you needed." Richard's expression shifted from anger to something else, regret. For the first time, Amara saw a crack in his armor. For the first time, he seemed like a man who wasn't just a billionaire CEO, but a man who had been betrayed by someone he loved. He took a deep breath, stepping away from Nicole. The silence in the room was deafening. People were watching him, waiting for him to respond, but Richard didn't know what to say. He had built his empire on being in control, but now he was completely at a loss. "I don't know what to do," Richard muttered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." Amara looked at him, her eyes steady. "It's not about fixing it," she said. "It's about facing it. It's about accepting the truth, even when it hurts, and then making the decision to move forward, no matter what happens next." The room seemed to exhale a collective breath. Richard stood there for a moment longer, processing Amara's words. Then, slowly, he turned back to Nicole, his gaze hardening. "You're not who I thought you were," he said quietly. Nicole opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She knew that any excuse she tried to offer would fall flat. Richard had already seen the truth, and there was nothing she could do to change that. "Leave," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his decision. "Leave now." Nicole's face contorted in shock, but she said nothing. With a quick glance at the guests, she turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. As she left, the room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. Amara had done what no one else dared do. She had stood up, exposed the truth, and forced the situation to change. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to stir, conversations starting up again, but now with a new awareness in the air. Richard remained silent for a long time, his mind spinning. The grandeur of the wedding, the lavish decorations, the perfect smiles, all of it seemed so distant now. He was no longer the powerful CEO, in control of everything. He was just a man who had been exposed, vulnerable and uncertain. And as the reality of the situation sank in, he couldn't help but feel gratitude for Amara. She had given him the opportunity to see beyond the wealth and status, to see the truth of who he was, and who the people around him really were. He looked at Amara, finally meeting her gaze. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. Amara nodded, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to thank me. Just remember this moment. And remember the lesson it teaches." Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. He had been living in a world where his money had shielded him from the truth, but now, in the wake of this revelation, he knew he couldn't go back to that world. He had to change, or risk losing everything he had built. Amara turned to walk away, her job done. She had come into the room as a waitress, a mere servant to the elite. But by the time she left, she had changed the course of the night, possibly the course of Richard's life. As she made her way to the kitchen, the guests continued to talk, their whispers filled with the knowledge that they had witnessed something rare, something that had shifted the balance of power in the room. Amara didn't look back. She had done what she came to do, and now it was time to move forward. For her, there was no glory in exposing the truth. There was only the satisfaction of knowing that, for once, justice had been done. I apologize for the dramatic turn the evening had taken, but the consequences of the truth were still unfolding. As Amara made her way out of the grand hall, she could hear the whispers behind her, the murmurs of the guests as they processed what had just happened. They were talking, but she didn't need to listen. She had done her part, and now it was up to Richard to figure out the next step. Back in the main hall, Richard stood frozen, his mind reeling from the revelation. The guests had finally dispersed, but he remained standing, staring at the empty space where Nicole had stood moments before. The truth had been exposed, and for the first time, Richard felt a vulnerability he wasn't used to. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, using his wealth and influence to shield himself from the harsh realities of the world. But now, those walls had come crashing down, and he was left exposed. He had been living in a world where power was everything, where people bowed to him, respected him, and feared him. But none of that mattered now. He had been deceived by the one person he trusted most. The one person who had promised to love him, to be by his side, had betrayed him for nothing more than money and status. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady himself. His thoughts were jumbled, his heart heavy with regret. He had thought that he had it all, the wealth, the influence, the power. But in that moment, it all seemed so meaningless. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He had neglected the most important things: honesty, loyalty, and love. And now, it was too late to fix it. As he turned and walked towards the exit, his mind kept replaying the events of the night. The look in Amara's eyes as she spoke the truth, the way she had stood up to him, a mere waitress, and exposed the lies. He had never been so humbled in his life. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the handle. He turned back to look at the empty room one last time. Everything had changed. The life he knew, the people he surrounded himself with, all of it seemed so shallow now. The only thing that mattered now was finding a way to rebuild, to regain what he had lost. But how could he rebuild when the foundation he had built it all on was so flawed? He walked out into the cool night air, the city lights flickering in the distance. It was a long walk to his car, but he didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, he was walking alone. He was no longer the powerful CEO with the world at his feet. He was just a man, trying to figure out where to go from here. As he approached his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from his assistant. "Sir, we've just received a call from Nicole. She's claiming that you've overreacted, that she didn't mean to hurt you. She wants to meet with you." Richard stared at the message for a moment, then shook his head. He didn't need to meet with her. There was nothing left to say. The truth had already been laid bare. He didn't need her excuses, and he didn't need her lies anymore. As he slid into the driver's seat of his car, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The weight of the night was heavy, but for the first time, it wasn't because of the pressure of success or the expectations of others. It was because he had finally faced the truth. And facing the truth, as painful as it was, had been the first step toward healing. As he drove away from the venue, he realized something important. He had lost Nicole, but in a way, he had gained something much more valuable. He had gained the clarity to see what truly mattered. He had gained the freedom to choose a new path. And that, more than anything, was what he needed to move forward. I apologize for the events that had unfolded earlier, but Richard knew that his journey was far from over. The weight of the truth hung heavily on his shoulders, but now he was more determined than ever to rebuild what he had lost. It was a cold night, and as he drove through the streets, the city lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement, he found himself thinking about Amara, the woman who had exposed the truth, who had stood up when no one else dared to. She had done what he could not, and in doing so, she had changed everything. He could still hear her words in his mind. "It's not about fixing it, it's about facing it." That simple statement had stuck with him more than anything else. He had been hiding behind his wealth, his success, thinking it was enough to shield him from the truth, but now he knew better. He had always prided himself on being in control, but tonight, Amara had taken control of the situation in a way he never expected. The truth had been laid bare, and for the first time in years, Richard felt vulnerable, unsure of what to do next. As he pulled up to his mansion, he sat for a moment, looking at the grand entrance. The house, the cars, the success. It all seemed so meaningless now. Nicole was gone, the betrayal exposed, and all that remained was the realization that everything he had worked for might not be enough to save him from the consequences of his choices. The next morning, Richard woke up to an empty house. The silence was deafening. He had spent so many years in this house, surrounded by luxury and opulence, but it no longer felt like home. He walked through the rooms, each one a reminder of the life he had built, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just Nicole. He had lost himself along the way. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant. "Sir, I've arranged a meeting with some of the investors. They're concerned about the fallout from last night. They want to discuss next steps." Richard stared at the screen for a moment before putting the phone down. He didn't want to deal with the investors. He didn't want to go back to the corporate world just yet. He needed time to think, to figure out who he was without the mask of success. But as the day went on, he realized that he couldn't avoid reality forever. The business world would still demand his attention, and if he wanted to rebuild, he would need to face those who had supported him, and those who had once placed their trust in him. Meanwhile, Amara went on with her life, quietly. She had done what she knew was right, but now she returned to her routine. There was no victory parade, no acknowledgement of the role she had played in the billionaire's downfall. She worked long hours at the restaurant, serving customers with the same grace and dignity she always had. But in the back of her mind, she knew that what had happened was bigger than any of them. It wasn't about the wedding or the betrayal. It was about truth, justice, and the ability to stand up for what's right. It was about being seen, even when society didn't want to see you. She was tired, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed something inside her. Maybe it was the sense of justice. Maybe it was the satisfaction of knowing that for once, she had done something that truly mattered. As the days passed, Richard tried to get back to his normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. He sat in his office, looking at the papers in front of him, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't focus on the deals, the contracts, the numbers. All he could think about was Amara and the way she had spoken to him, the way she had exposed the truth without hesitation. He knew that she had done it because it was the right thing to do, and that made him realize how much he had been blinded by his own sense of importance. As he sat there, Richard made a decision. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without learning from it. He wasn't going to let his wealth or power define him anymore. He needed to change. He needed to start over, to rebuild not just his empire, but his integrity. The next day, he contacted Amara. He wanted to meet her, to thank her for showing him the truth. He wasn't sure if she would even want to speak to him, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't ignore what she had done for him. He couldn't ignore the impact she had had on his life. As Richard made the call, he felt a sense of resolve wash over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't the man he used to be, and that was okay. The man who had built his empire on wealth and power was gone, and in his place was someone who was willing to rebuild from the ground up. It was a humbling realization, but also the beginning of something new. I apologize for the shift in dynamics, but Richard's decision was made. He needed to make amends, not only with the people who had been affected by his actions, but most importantly, with himself. He had spent years focusing on numbers, contracts, and control, but now he realized that none of that mattered without integrity. He couldn't just continue on the same path. It was time to break free from the cycle of power that had consumed him. After days of contemplation, Richard reached out to Amara. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to find a way to speak to her. She had done something that no one else had done before. She had opened his eyes to the truth about himself. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get from her, but he had to try. He called her that afternoon. "Amara," Richard's voice was steady but hesitant. "I know you might not want to speak with me, but I need to thank you. What you did, I can't even begin to express how much it's changed me. I know this might not be the right time, but can we meet?" He paused, almost nervously waiting for a response. "I understand if you don't want to, but I have to say something in person." There was a long silence before Amara's calm voice answered. "You've already said what needed to be said." Richard's heart sank slightly, but Amara continued, "But I'll meet you. We can talk." The relief he felt was immediate. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that this meeting, this moment, was going to be important. The next day, Richard arrived at a small cafe, the kind of place he would have ignored in the past. It wasn't extravagant or luxurious, but in that moment, it felt right. As he stepped inside, he spotted Amara sitting in a corner booth. She looked the same as she had the night of the wedding, calm, composed, and completely unbothered by the opulence around her. Her presence, so simple and grounded, was exactly what Richard needed. He approached the table, and Amara looked up, giving him a nod. "Amara," Richard began, his voice sincere, "I've been living my life all wrong. I've focused on the wrong things for so long that I didn't even realize how blind I had become. You opened my eyes, and for that, I'm truly grateful." Amara listened without interrupting, her gaze steady. She didn't respond immediately, but Richard could see that she wasn't in a rush to dismiss him either. He continued, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want to learn from this. I want to do better, not just for my business, but for the people around me, for the people I've hurt." There was a long pause. Richard waited, unsure of how she would respond. Amara finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You've already started by realizing what you've been doing wrong. But that's just the first step. The real work starts now. It's not enough to just acknowledge your mistakes. You have to be willing to change, to actually make an effort." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know that. And I will. I'm ready to put in the work." Amara studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "Just remember, change isn't a one-time thing. It's a constant process. And don't think that people will automatically trust you because you've had a moment of clarity. It takes time to rebuild what's been broken." Richard could feel the truth in her words, and they struck him deeply. This wasn't going to be easy. He had a lot of work ahead of him. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with money or power. It was about growth, real growth, as a person. "I understand," he said quietly. "I've been living in the shadow of my own success for too long, and I let that cloud everything. But I'm done with that. I want to change." Amara nodded slightly. "Then it starts here, Richard. It starts with being honest with yourself and with others." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. Richard had come to this meeting seeking answers, but he left with something much more valuable. The understanding that real change wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about the small, everyday choices he made to live with integrity and honesty. As they finished their conversation, Richard felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it, not as the billionaire CEO, but as someone who had learned the true value of humility and truth. "I apologize for the pause in the journey," but Richard knew he had to take the next step. He had faced the consequences of his actions, acknowledged the damage done, and now it was time to make things right, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. It wasn't going to be easy, and he understood that. The road to redemption wasn't paved with grand gestures. It was built on consistency, humility, and the willingness to learn from his past mistakes. Over the following weeks, Richard began to distance himself from the lavish lifestyle that had once defined him. The penthouse, the extravagant dinners, the meetings with high-powered investors, they all felt empty now. He knew he couldn't go back to that life, not without fundamentally changing the way he viewed success. He started spending more time with the people who mattered, the ones who had always been there for him, the people who had been neglected in his pursuit of power and wealth. It wasn't about the status anymore. It was about the connections, the relationships, and the things he had overlooked while chasing after the wrong dreams. Meanwhile, Amara had returned to her normal routine, serving tables at the same restaurant she had always worked at. Life had returned to its ordinary pace, but she couldn't ignore the impact her actions had had on Richard's life. The truth had been exposed, and he was no longer the same man. As Amara served drinks and cleared plates, she couldn't help but wonder how things would unfold for him. She didn't expect any grand thanks, but she knew that, somehow, she had made a difference. One night, after finishing her shift, she found herself walking home in the crisp evening air. The streets of the city were quiet, the glow from street lamps casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She passed the same familiar buildings, the same bustling corners, but everything felt different. She felt different. The simple act of standing up for what was right had changed her in a way she couldn't explain. She had always been content to stay in the background, to fade into the shadows, but that night had pushed her to step forward. And now, there was no going back. As she approached her apartment building, she heard a familiar voice calling out her name. She turned to see Richard, standing across the street, looking unsure of himself. Amara paused, a bit surprised. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone out here, on the street. Amara, Richard called again, his voice softer than usual. I've been looking for you. Amara raised an eyebrow but didn't move toward him. What's this about? She asked, her tone calm, though she was curious. Richard took a step forward, his eyes locked with hers. I just wanted to thank you for what you did. You changed everything for me. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about facing the truth. He paused, taking a breath before continuing. I've started making changes, real changes. I can't undo what I've done, but I'm not going to run from it anymore. Amara stood silently for a moment, processing his words. She wasn't sure what she expected, but this wasn't it. Richard, the billionaire CEO who had once seemed untouchable, was now standing here, admitting his flaws and taking responsibility for them. It wasn't the apology she had anticipated, but it was something more meaningful, an acknowledgement of growth, of transformation. I'm glad to hear that, Amara replied, her voice steady. But you're the one who has to live with those changes. Not me. I just did what was right. Richard nodded, understanding her point. I know, but I wouldn't have seen it if it wasn't for you. You were the one who had the courage to stand up when no one else would. Amara looked away, her gaze drifting to the ground for a moment. I didn't do it for you, Richard, she said quietly. I did it for what's right. For the people who don't have a voice, for the ones who are overlooked. Richard's expression softened. I understand that now, and I can't thank you enough for that. For a brief moment, there was an awkward silence between them. Neither of them knew exactly what to say next. Amara, though, felt something shift inside her. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I'm not asking for anything, Richard added, his voice sincere. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying. And I hope, someday, that you'll see the difference. Amara nodded, acknowledging his words. We'll see, she said, her tone firm but not unkind. She turned to walk away, but Richard called out to her one more time. Amara, he said, take care of yourself. She paused but didn't look back. You too, she replied softly, before continuing down the street. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel that something had changed between them. It wasn't a friendship, and it wasn't a reconciliation, but there was a mutual understanding now. Amara had done what she needed to do, and Richard had taken the first step toward real change. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, both of them had hope. Richard watched her disappear into the distance, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew that, for the first time, he was on the right path. And that, in itself, was enough. I apologize for the pause in the journey, but Richard knew that this moment was his turning point. His life, his business, his identity, it had all been built on the foundation of power and control, but now he realized that he had been living in a false reality. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge his mistakes. He had to prove that he was capable of change. He had to show everyone, especially himself, that he could rise from the ashes of his own ego. Over the next few weeks, Richard made it a point to live differently. He began by stepping down from several of his high-profile positions in his company. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary. He realized that he had been so wrapped up in his business that he had forgotten the importance of being present, of being human. The corporate world had been his fortress, a place where he felt invincible, but now it felt suffocating. He reached out to some of the employees he had once ignored, asking for their thoughts, their input, something he had never done before. It was awkward at first. People didn't know how to react to the new Richard, the one who listened instead of dictating, the one who acknowledged his flaws instead of pretending they didn't exist. But slowly, the people around him began to see the change. His colleagues and employees, the ones who had always seen him as a figure of power, began to respect him in a way they hadn't before. Not because of his wealth, but because of his willingness to grow. Meanwhile, Amara had continued with her life, but there was a change in her too. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, she had unknowingly changed Richard's path. It wasn't something she had expected, nor something she had wanted, but she couldn't deny the impact it had on her. It felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She no longer felt invisible. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was someone who had made a difference. One evening, after a long shift, Amara sat in her small apartment, the quiet of the room filling her thoughts. The city outside was alive with the hum of traffic, but inside, it was peaceful. She had come to realize that the world wasn't as big as it seemed. The moments when you choose to stand up, even in the smallest ways, could lead to bigger changes. She had done something good, something important, but there was still a part of her that couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Just as she sat back to rest, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "Amara," the text began, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to thank you again. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to change. I want to do more than just apologize. I want to give back, and I believe that you've shown me what truly matters. Can we meet again? I'd like to hear your thoughts on how I can make things right." Amara stared at the message for a long moment. She didn't expect Richard to reach out again, but there it was. A sincere request for her input, for her thoughts. Something had shifted in him, and she could see that. She didn't hesitate to respond. "Let's meet," she typed back. "But this time, it's on my terms." The meeting was set for the following week. Richard, for the first time, was nervous. He had no idea what to expect. He had no agenda. He wasn't looking for validation. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to understand. When the day arrived, Richard walked into the cafe they had agreed upon, a small, unassuming place in the heart of the city. It wasn't like the venues he was used to, the lavish boardrooms or five-star restaurants, but it felt more real, more grounded. He saw Amara sitting at a table by the window, her expression calm but guarded. As he approached, he could see the subtle shift in her demeanor, a slight warmth in her eyes. She had seen something in him that night, something that he had buried under layers of arrogance and pride. But now, he was standing in front of her as someone different. He sat down across from her, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, no words exchanged. Finally, Richard spoke. "Amara," he said softly, "I want to make sure that I'm not just going through the motions. I want to be a better person, not just in business, but in life. But I don't know where to start." Amara didn't answer right away. She thought about his words carefully before responding. "Start with being honest," she said. "Honest with yourself and with others. You've spent so much time hiding behind your wealth and power, but those things don't define who you are. It's your actions, your integrity, your willingness to do right by others that will shape you from here on out." Richard nodded, taking in her words. It wasn't a complicated answer, but it was the truth. For the first time, he understood. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, but he was ready to begin. As they continued to talk, the conversation shifted. Richard asked Amara about her life, about her dreams, about the things she valued. She spoke about her experiences, about the challenges she faced, and the small victories that had helped her get to where she was. By the time the meeting ended, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, but he no longer feared it. He knew that, with time, he could rebuild. And this time, he would do it right. "I apologize for the change in pace," but Richard had learned something he could not forget. A week had passed since his meeting with Amara, and as he sat at his desk that morning, a new sense of clarity filled his mind. He had come to understand that real change wasn't about external validation or grand gestures. It was about consistency and integrity. And so he began. He started making visible changes, small yet meaningful. First, he reached out to those he had once disregarded, his employees, his business partners, even former friends, apologizing for the way he had treated them. He had once thought of relationships as transactions, but now, he knew they were the foundation of any lasting success. It was humbling work. Some accepted his apologies readily, others were more skeptical, but that didn't matter. He was committed to making things right, even if it took time. In the days that followed, Richard began to shift his focus. The company still needed leadership, but he knew it was time to step back from the driving force he had been. He appointed a trusted colleague to take over day-to-day operations, giving himself the space to rebuild not only his reputation, but his inner self. It was a difficult transition, one that many of his peers didn't understand. But Richard was done seeking approval from the outside world. His personal journey had become more important than his career accomplishments. Meanwhile, Amara, though busy with her daily life, noticed subtle changes in the world around her. Richard's actions hadn't gone unnoticed, and whispers of his efforts to change began circulating. Some of her co-workers at the restaurant had heard about his new approach, his humility, and they were surprised. Many of them had written him off as a typical rich, arrogant CEO, but now they saw a different side of him, one that recognized his flaws and worked to correct them. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Amara had kept her distance. She wasn't looking for gratitude or recognition. But the truth was, seeing the impact of her words on Richard had made her feel something she had never expected: hope. For the first time, she believed that change was possible, even for the powerful and untouchable. As weeks passed, Richard reached out to Amara again, this time not for advice or validation, but simply to offer his gratitude. He invited her to meet him at the same cafe where they had spoken before. Amara was surprised, but she agreed. They sat across from each other once again. But this time, there was no tension, no grand speeches. Just a simple conversation between two people who had both been changed by the events of the past month. "Amara," Richard said quietly, "I know I've already said this, but I want to say it again. Thank you. You changed my life. I'm not the man I was before, and I can't go back to that life. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready to face it." Amara studied him for a moment. "You're doing the right thing, Richard," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "But it's not about perfection. It's about consistency. You have to keep working at it. Every day." Richard nodded, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road he was now willing to walk. "I know, and I will. I promise." Amara smiled softly. "I'm glad to hear that." As they parted ways that afternoon, Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He was on a new path, one that wasn't defined by wealth, power, or public approval. It was a path defined by personal growth, by the willingness to do what was right, even when it was hard. For Amara, the journey had been different, but no less significant. She hadn't sought to change Richard's life, but in doing what was right, she had found her own sense of purpose. She knew that the world was full of challenges, full of injustices, but she also knew that every small action, every moment of standing up for what was right, could lead to a bigger change. And that change didn't always have to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, humble, and still powerful. Amara didn't know what the future held for her, but she was confident that, like Richard, she would continue to grow. She had done what was right, and in the process, she had discovered a new kind of strength, one that came from within, not from the approval of others. For both of them, it wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where integrity and truth would guide their choices, where they would both continue to learn and grow. As Richard looked out at the city skyline that evening, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in his life, he was ready for whatever came next. In this powerful journey, Richard Kesler, a billionaire CEO, finds himself facing a life-changing revelation after his wedding is interrupted by a waitress who exposes his bride's shocking betrayal. As the story unfolds, Richard begins to understand the true meaning of integrity and humility, guided by the unexpected actions of Amara, a black waitress who dares to speak the truth when no one else will. This black story explores themes of self-discovery, personal growth, and the importance of doing what is right, no matter the consequences. Richard's transformation is not about wealth or status. It is about learning from his mistakes and striving to be a better person. Amara, though she never sought recognition, shows how one act of courage can have a profound impact on someone's life. As their paths intersect, both Richard and Amara discover the value of honesty and accountability, finding new strength in their shared journey. This black story is a testament to the power of truth, personal redemption, and the courage to change. Watch how these characters evolve and learn from their actions, and how their lives are transformed by the courage to stand up for what is right. The ripple effect of Amara's actions reminds us that black stories are not just about adversity. They are about resilience, change, and the ongoing pursuit of justice.